I am here at the Grant-Kohrs Ranch National Historic Site in the Deer Lodge Valley of southwestern Montana. At one point, this would have been one of the largest cattle ranches in the United States, and in fact, the National Park Service still operates it as one today. Now, I know what you might be thinking, Cameron, if you are so close to Yellowstone and Glacier, if you're here in southwestern Montana, why are you doing a story on a cattle ranch? And to that, I would say that I forgot to do my reservations in time, but you guys know that I love my small historical parks, and when I learned of this place's story, I knew I had to tell it here on the channel. This place tells the story of the open range era of cattle ranching, the heyday of the cowboy. But this story is not just about cowboys and cattle ranches. It's a story about hardship and struggle, perseverance and self-reliance, wealth and influence. This is a story about an ethos that came to dominate how we perceive the West today. This is the story of the Grant-Kohrs Ranch. Alright, what this video is not going to be is a discussion on modern American grazing policy and its associated environmental impacts. That is actually a really great topic, and I will cover it at some point in the future, but for now I just want to focus on the Grant-Kohrs Ranch and how it became so symbolic of a hugely influential period in Western development.
That time period is the mid-19th century. And this ranch, destined to become the centerpiece of an American cattle empire, actually has very humble beginnings. The story starts with a man named Johnny Francis Grant. He was a French-Canadian fur trapper who came west with his father at age 16. Stationed at a Hudson Bay Company outpost in Pocatello, Idaho, the younger Grant began his life on the frontier. He quickly learned that life was not easy out here. A swift kick to the head from a malcontented calf taught him the hard way. But this was his first exposure to a business which would suit him well: cattle ranching. He set out from the confines of Pocatello, first as a fur trader like his father, but he soon discovered the lucrative cattle business after trading furs and pelts for cows with the westward bound travelers of the Oregon Trail. Grant would acquire the weary cattle, nourish them in the broad, flat valleys of southwestern Montana, and return them to the trail in exchange for more cattle. In this way, Grant accumulated over 4,000 head of cattle, 3,000 horses, and a net worth of $150,000, more than $3.5 million today. He would go on to be one of the founders of modern-day Deer Lodge, Montana, where he also started the ranch that lies at the heart of our story. By the 1860s, however, gold had been discovered in Montana, and the rush was on. Prospectors entered the valley, and Grant, a native French speaker, found himself taken advantage of in the all-English business dealings of these new arrivals. He wanted out of the game. One such arrival was a man named Conrad Coors, an immigrant looking to strike it rich in the cattle business himself. He took Grant up on his offer, buying the ranch for $19,000.
Grant left the valley and returned to Canada, but not before he left an indelible mark on this area of southwest Montana. The ranch and the empire that would be built on it served as a symbol of a culture and a way of life that came to define the western United States in the second half of the 20th century. Johnny Francis Grant and his ranch were at the vanguard of that lifestyle.
But it was Conrad Coors who would go on to raise the ranch to new heights. Born in 1835 in Germany, Coors led an incredibly varied life before his time as a cattleman. He traveled in Africa, Brazil, and Cuba before arriving in the States, where he worked as a butcher, sausage seller, logger, and distiller before prospecting set him on the path to southwest Montana. After purchasing the ranch from Johnny Grant, Coors became an incredibly successful cattleman. He oversaw a cattle empire of 50,000 heads spanning 10 million acres spread across 4 states and Canada, an empire that would earn him the name the Cattle King of Montana. For the next 20 years, Coors and his cattle empire came to symbolize the open range era, where thousands of cattle grazed over millions of acres of public land. This was the cowboy era. This was the lifestyle that became mythologized in movies and pop culture. Ranchers driving their herds hundreds of miles to pasture or to market, unfenced open land, the freedom to roam wherever they pleased. On the saddle for months at a time, this was a culture of independence and self-reliance and rugged individualism. That mythology that we're all familiar with today was born here at the tail end of the 19th century on the plains and grasslands of the West, and Conrad Coors was at the heart of it. By the 1880s, he was shipping 10,000 head of cattle to Chicago for slaughter. His influence now reached beyond the confines of southwest Montana and onto the dinner plates of the nation. A once humble ranch started by Johnny Francis Grant in the Deer Lodge Valley of Montana was now a player on the national stage. And Coors didn't rest on his laurels. He made sure to diversify his interests into mining claims and real estate as well as cattle. In this way, he was able to leverage the success of his cattle empire for political and social power. He was the founder of the Montana Stock Growers Association, which sought to coordinate ranchers around the state for the benefit of the entire industry and the wealth of the cattlemen themselves. In 1889, Coors was elected to the Montana Constitutional Convention, meaning quite literally he would play a role in the creation of the treasure state itself, further entwining himself in its storied history.
And I want to pause here a moment to point out, though, that none of this would have been possible without the forced removal and extermination of 2 things: the indigenous population that lived here and the bison which they depended on. Cattle empires and the open range were built on the lands vacated by their original inhabitants through no choice of their own. In this area of Montana, that would have been the Kootenai and Salish peoples, who utilized the broad, flat valleys for trade and hunting opportunities. Divorced of grazing competition, that was the bison, and the local populace, cattle ranchers thrived on the now empty plains of the West. That's an unfortunate part of this story and the story of the West as a whole, but it has to be acknowledged here. And in fact, it plays into the larger point of this video, the reason I wanted to make it at all in the first place. Cattle empires of the kind that Conrad Coors oversaw, now preserved as a national park, were at the heart of how the West developed and how we still perceive it today. Power or lack thereof, wealth or lack thereof, opportunity or lack thereof can be traced back not exclusively to cattle ranches, but they were certainly one of the big power players at a time when this area of the country was coming of age, when its power structures and dynamics were being built from the ground up, when the modern-day foundations of these places were being forged. Those who had power and influence at this time were the ones determining how these lands and these societies would operate for the future. Railroad tycoons, miners, oilmen, and yes, cattle barons were the ones with that power. These were the industries shaping the fledgling West in their image. If you were a big player in one of these industries, you were a big player in determining how the West developed. Conrad Coors and the Grant-Kohrs Ranch were part of this, and the West we see today is a direct result of those decisions made at this ranch on the open range over 100 years ago.
But while shining incredibly brightly, the star that was the open range era did not burn for very long. The winter of 1886 saw to that. By this time, more and more cattle had been imported to the western rangelands, meaning each head of individual cattle received less and less forage. Going into the winter of 1886, the herds of the West were already undernourished. A dry summer and lackluster growing season furthered this deficiency. Winter came early and stayed late. A blizzard in January made grazing impossible. Temperatures dropped to 60 below zero. Losses were anywhere between 60 and 95% of the total herd size for any given rancher. Conrad Coors was largely able to survive this brutal winter, thanks in large part to his already healthy economic position. Other outfits were not so lucky. The era of the open range was over. Never again would there be large cattle drives, unfenced open spaces, or the classic cowboy lifestyle. The Grant-Kohrs Ranch shifted its focus to breeding and scaled their operation back to the home ranch in Deer Lodge. Conrad Coors died in 1920, and in 1922, the ranch passed into the stewardship of the Coors Trust. In 1940, Conrad Coors Warren, grandson of the legendary cattleman, bought the ranch. He ran it, albeit on a much smaller scale, as his grandfather would have wanted, as a cattle ranch. In addition, the young Warren sought to preserve the history, culture, and lifestyle the ranch came to embody, and in 1972, he sold it to the National Park Service to ensure that that was the case.
Which is where I will leave you. Here at the ranch, so emblematic of what the West came to be. Of all the industries that came to dominate the West, politically, socially, and economically, perhaps none became more mythologized than the open-range cattle ranching industry. Its legacy lives on in movies, books, TV shows, and in our culture more broadly. I hope I've been able to show you how, through the preservation of a place like the Grant-Kohrs Ranch, we are able to tap into that story, to reflect on our world today and see the world of yesterday, to see how the choices made by the people on this ranch over 100 years ago would go on to shape the next century of life here in Southwest Montana and in the West. Okay, thank you so much for watching. As you can see, I am here in my hotel room now. I originally wanted to film this entire video, or most of this entire video, out at the ranch itself, which I in fact did do a few days ago, but the audio was completely unusable. So I had to come back today on a limited schedule, and I couldn't do as much filming out there as I would have liked, hence the hotel room, this weird backdrop, and the shady, shoddy voiceover. So my apologies for that, but that is kind of how it goes sometimes when you go out and you film in the field, especially with gear like this and with the weather out here and my failures to plug in my microphone. But nonetheless, these field trips out here to the parks are really what I want this channel to be. And the support of you guys here on YouTube and on Patreon is a big way to do that. So liking, subscribing, and hitting the little bell is a big way to help these stories reach more people. And that's basically all I'm trying to do here. So that's one way you can support me. Field trips like this also are quite literally impossible without the help of my patrons. They help to fund these things, to get me out here, to immerse myself in the parks, to help bring you guys these stories. So if you want to support me more directly, that's patreon.com/National Park Diaries. You can also follow me on Instagram. I'll be posting some pictures from my travels out here. And that's also probably like just the best place to get in touch with me. YouTube's not a very good place for that. So follow me on Instagram if you would like. Other than that, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.